Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more.
Susan's call on Saturday morning caught me off guard. It wasn't the call itself, but what she said that was surprising. We had been talking regularly, both on and off the phone, ever since we first met in college. As newly paired roommates, we had sized each other up, examining our wardrobes with a cautious eye, and quickly determined that we wouldn't embarrass one another. We've been best friends ever since. Typically, our Saturday morning calls were dedicated to finalizing the details of our afternoon shopping trips, dress shops, makeup counters, and shoe departments. We approached these outings with the precision and seriousness of a mission. But not this time. Susan was backing out of our usual shopping spree and instead invited me to lunch at her house. For Susan to willingly choose a quiet afternoon at home instead of trekking through boutique dressing rooms was highly unusual. It made me as suspicious as a detective on a case. And, as it turned out, my instincts were right. When I arrived at her charming brick colonial home and rang the doorbell, I wasn't expecting Daniel to answer. But there he was, Susan's 12-year-old son. To be honest, I wouldn't have recognized him right away if not for his signature short, messy blonde hair, now neatly combed and styled with a subtle pompadour, a look he'd never worn before. Susan's hairdresser, Michelle, had been giving Daniel his signature mop top for years. He wasn't thrilled about it, but as long as Michelle kept cutting his hair, it was a routine he accepted. However, there were times when Daniel was the only male customer at the salon, a fact that never sat comfortably with him. What was more notable, though, was his harmless crush on Michelle, one of those crushes that boys his age have on women far outside their age range. He idolized her without ever needing to act on it, confident in his unrequited affection. Daniel's latest reasoning for putting up with these salon visits was simple: he liked girls. And the girls, for the most part, liked him too. His peers considered him one of the more eligible bachelors in his grade, partly due to his thick, enviable hair. But if the girls could see him now, they'd likely change their opinions from his cute to how cute. The right side of his head now sported a dainty pink bow, pinned in place by a bobby pin. The contrast between the bow and his otherwise boyish haircut was glaring, and Daniel, his cheeks flushed, looked absolutely mortified. Susan, standing behind him, beamed with pride, as though Daniel were the picture of a well-dressed young man, except he wasn't. He was dolled up like a little girl at a fancy birthday party. It wasn't done in a clumsy way, though, like a boy with smeared lipstick on Halloween. No, Daniel looked like a delicate little girl with just enough makeup to give her a polished appearance, though the mascara, blush, and lipstick, especially the eyeliner, made him resemble a pageant contestant more than anything else. Daniel was speechless, his discomfort palpable as he stood frozen, a mix of fear and embarrassment written all over his face. "Hello, Daniel," I said, trying to break the tension. "My, don't you look nice?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. It was the kind of polite remark you'd make to any child dressed up, regardless of gender. I would have said the same thing if he'd greeted me in a formal suit. I immediately regretted it. Not because it wasn't true, he did look sweet, but because my words only seemed to make him feel worse. It probably came off as sarcastic, though that was never my intention. "Hello, Claire," he mumbled, his voice cracking. Susan finally spoke, smiling at me as she watched Daniel. "What do you say, Daniel?" Daniel turned to Susan, his eyes wide with panic, on the verge of tears. He clearly knew he was supposed to say something but had no idea what. "What is going on?" I wondered silently. "Aren't you going to thank Claire?" Susan prompted. "Oh, thank you," Daniel said, his voice robotic, as though reciting lines. "Mommy picked everything out." I was certain she had. 12-year-old boys aren't exactly known for putting together outfits featuring a fuchsia party dress, white ankle socks, and black patent leather Mary Janes. Nor do they typically carry a Barbie doll, like the one Daniel held under his arm, or sling a purse over their shoulder. "Why don't you bring us some tea, dear?" while I explain your situation to Claire," Susan suggested. I definitely needed something stronger than tea, but hoped Susan's explanation would at least offer some comfort. "Daniel's being punished," Susan said as we sat down in her living room. She was dressed in heels, a skirt, and a nice blouse, far from her usual laid-back home attire, even for a fashionista like her. As she slipped out of her shoes and tucked her legs under her, I was amazed at how calm she seemed given the circumstances. I, on the other hand, was visibly uncomfortable. I tugged at the hem of my skirt, needing something to occupy my hands. I, too, was a bit overdressed, but I had a reason. I wanted to show Susan my new shoes. They were the shoes of the season, round-toed Prada pumps with a high, chunky heel. Impossible to find, but chic. As always, Susan and I had turned shoe hunting into a friendly competition. After a series of emails and phone calls, I had tracked them down at a Prada boutique in Los Angeles, and they had arrived at my door that morning. "Well, that's a relief," I said in response. "I'd hate to think you were dressing him up like that as a reward. What did he do, steal some nuclear secrets?" She was about to respond when her eyes landed on my shoes. "Oh, I hate you," she exclaimed. "Where did you find them?" I could have pointed out that she might want to focus on finding shoes for herself instead of her son, but I refrained. Instead, I reveled in my triumph and recounted my shoe search story, adding dramatic flourishes where I could. Daniel entered halfway through my tale, carrying a fancy tea set on a silver tray. He served us, carefully placing the tray on the coffee table, then sat on the love seat across from me. Susan nodded at him, and I noticed her glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. I followed her gaze, watching Daniel adjust his skirt and sit with surprising grace. He crossed his legs at the ankles, hands delicately resting on his right thigh. His nails were painted a soft pink. It was like something straight out of a Shirley Temple movie. "Perfect, sweetie," Susan praised. Daniel's movements had been impressively dainty. I wondered how many girls his age could sit down with that level of poise. "We've been practicing, haven't we?" Susan added, addressing me. Daniel mumbled a reply, but Susan was already moving on. "Claire wants to know why you're dressed up like this. Want to tell her?" The next few minutes were pure agony for Daniel. He wasn't eager to confess his transgression, and I could guess why. Though I didn't have kids of my own, I was close enough to Daniel that I treated him like a favorite nephew. He knew me well enough to dread my reaction. It turned out, as it often does with boys, that Daniel had done something careless and insensitive. He'd tried to kiss a girl in his class, someone who had been warned by others that he thought she was ugly and was only doing it on a dare. When she rejected him, he made things worse by calling her a vile, inappropriate name, one that started with C, which rhymed with words like B and T, and was bound to get him into serious trouble. Daniel didn't say the word outright, but it was easy to infer the meaning. And sure enough, he had said it loud enough for his teacher to overhear. The teacher, who didn't tolerate foul language, especially from a 12-year-old boy who likely didn't even understand the weight of the words he used, had reported it immediately. Susan had learned all the details at a meeting with Daniel's teacher and the school counselor. As a result, Daniel was suspended for 3 days and put on probation. The school's punishment was mild compared to Susan's reaction. She was absolutely furious. The drive home from school started with Susan shouting, "How could you embarrass me like this?" She didn't stop for a full half hour after we got home, continuing her tirade with increasing intensity. As if to make a point, she washed his mouth out with soap, and ended her lecture with the words that led to Daniel's current predicament: "Maybe if you knew what it was like to be a girl, you wouldn't act like this again." Unfortunately for Daniel, I'm a woman who intensely despises the C word. It had been an unfortunate part of my past, something I had suffered through in my marriage to a man who was as cruel with words as he was with actions. Having been exposed to it too many times, I was visibly upset as Daniel hesitantly confessed his mistake. He noticed the disappointment on my face. He realized there was no way I would speak up for him with Susan, and tears began to fill his eyes. As he cried, The mascara he wore smudged across his face. Susan, now frustrated, directed him to open his purse, pull out a tissue, pink, of course, and some mascara. She dabbed his eyes dry and was about to fix the mess when the phone rang. "Could you touch up his mascara?" she asked, handing me the tube and brush. "I'll be right back." Daniel wore a deer-in-the-headlights look, clearly distressed. "Please don't," he pleaded. "It's too embarrassing." I steadied his face, holding his chin firmly. Though I didn't entirely agree with Susan's way of handling things, I had to admit that it would likely be a long time before Daniel acted out like that again. "Hold still and look up," I said, my tone sharper than I meant. A few quick strokes of the mascara brush, and I was done. As I snapped the wand back into the tube, I realized I had been inspecting his lashes for a moment. Why did it matter? I thought. He certainly wasn't concerned with lumps or curls. Not knowing what to say, Daniel picked up a book lying next to him, Little Women. "Nice touch, Susan." She was still on the phone, giving me a moment to observe him. Daniel was sitting on the edge of the love seat, his eyes downcast. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly arranged, his primly crossed ankles and neat appearance. But as I looked closer, I could see that his graceful posture was more of a pose than anything natural. His face, bright with makeup but lacking in emotion, reminded me of an abandoned carnival doll, vulnerable, resigned, and no longer scared. He seemed defeated, like Cinderella locked away in her room after being forbidden to try on the glass slipper. I suddenly felt very sorry for him. "Daniel, look at me." He lifted his head, his eyes on the brink of tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I really am." "I know you are," I replied softly. "You're still my favorite little boy. Even dressed like this. Even dressed like that." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Besides, you're not going to have to wear that forever. Mom said for the rest of this weekend and all of next weekend." "But didn't I give you a chance to avoid next weekend?" I asked. Susan had just finished her phone call. "You've got a heart," I said to Susan. "What's he got to do, walk on hot coals?" "So you think the punishment doesn't fit the crime, huh?" Susan said. "I bet he'll never do anything like that again." "That's the point, isn't it?" "Susan, he's 12. He made a mistake." "Cruel, you mean?" "All right, he made a dumb and cruel mistake. So maybe we should take him out for ice cream instead?" Susan suggested. When Susan and I started bickering like this, it was a sign things were getting back to normal. We weren't good at arguing, usually. One of us would crack a joke, and we'd laugh together. I could tell Daniel was relieved too. For a few moments, at least, he wasn't the center of his mother's wrath. "Okay, you've convinced me," Susan said with a grin. "Daniel's going to wear a dress for 2 weekends in a row." Daniel winced. "But because you're such a tolerant mom, you're going to let him off the hook next weekend if..." Susan trailed off, turning to Daniel. "If I let someone other than mommy see me like this today," Daniel added. "And your mom picked me," Susan corrected. "No, I did," Daniel clarified. "I didn't think you'd make fun of me." His sincerity made me want to hug him, but Susan gave me a look that stopped me cold. "Aren't you leaving something out?" Susan asked. "Oh, Mom," Daniel groaned. "Maybe we should discuss your wardrobe for next weekend," Susan said, feigning exaggerated resignation, as though to suggest, "Well, I guess you'll want another weekend in dresses after all." "Do you think Daniel's old enough for heels?" she asked, making sure he understood before turning to him. "There were 2 conditions to your reprieve, if I remember correctly." Daniel's eyes darted between us. "I had to agree to dress like this in front of you and ask if you would help Mom." "Help whom?" Susan interrupted. "Help Mommy," Daniel corrected himself. "Teach me how to act like a perfect little lady." "You poor thing," I muttered, sympathizing with him. The last thing he wanted was anyone's help becoming a little powder puff. But what choice did he have? "I don't want to do this again next weekend," he said, a note of desperation in his voice. Now, it was up to me. I could either lose my temper with Susan, which was my first instinct, or I could refuse to participate in her plan and likely condemn Daniel to even more humiliating punishment. Or, as a way to ease his sentence, I could help Susan further transform her son into something he wasn't. Daniel, I need to talk to your mom alone for a few minutes. Do you think you could excuse us? I asked. You may go to your room and play with your doll, Susan said. But don't even think about playing with your boy toys. Yes, Mommy, Daniel replied, heading for the stairs. Daniel, where are your manners? Susan called after him. He stopped, turned around, and gave a surprisingly graceful curtsy. That was too much for me. He was barely out of earshot when I couldn't hold it in anymore. Are you out of your mind? I thought we agreed you wouldn't tell me how to raise my child. Then don't make me an accomplice to your enlightened methods. He chose you. I didn't. Susan, really? Who else was he going to choose? Maybe one of the girls from his class, so she could take photos and share them at show and tell? Do you think I'm that cruel? Susan snapped. The sharpness in her voice faded. Well, do you? I hesitated before replying. I'm not sure what to think, I said with a sigh. Let me make this more complicated for you, Susan said, lowering her voice as she moved closer. He's not suffering as much as you think. My confused look spurred her on. Daniel's too kind to do something like this. It's so out of character that I think it was intentional. I believe there's a part of Daniel that wants to dress like a girl, but is too afraid to admit it. So he did this, hoping I would punish him in this way. Susan, I think you're reading too much into this, I replied. Even if you're right about his reasons, how could he possibly know you were going to punish him by dressing him up like this? Susan paused, a hint of guilt on her face. Unless, I said, putting the pieces together, you've punished him this way before. Not exactly, she admitted. Well, then exactly how? I asked, my tone shifting from one of interrogation to genuine concern. What's really going on here? Little things, she said, as if relieved to confess. I've made him play with dolls before. And the clothes? I pressed. Oh, this is the first time I've really dressed him up, she said. But I've had him wear lipstick and an apron, helping me around the house. Why? That must be awful for him. I'm surprised he hasn't run away. Now you're being dramatic. Does he just go along with it? No, but that's the point, Susan said. The first time I put lipstick on him, he begged me not to. He was convincing. But since then, I've felt like he protests just enough to make me believe he's being forced, even though I think deep down he's not as upset as he pretends to be. That's why I went overboard this time. I thought maybe it would shock him. And has it worked? I asked. I really don't think so, Susan said. Oh, he's embarrassed, but I think it's more because he knows he's not supposed to like it. Whether this is a terrible punishment for him is still unclear. You'll see for yourself if you stay. I'm not sure I want to be involved in this, I said. It just doesn't feel right. Aren't you worried? About what? Come on, Susan. That he'll grow up to be gay? Exactly, I said. You weren't worried about that when he was 5 and you couldn't wait to dress him up like a little ballerina for Halloween. If I remember correctly, you drove 2 hours just to borrow your niece's ballet slippers. It was true. Susan and I had thoroughly enjoyed dressing Daniel up as a fairy princess. That's not fair, I said. He was only 5, and lots of boys dress up as girls for Halloween. Not like we dressed him up, Susan pointed out. You couldn't even tell he was a boy. We were thrilled every time someone mistook him for a girl. I had no trouble recalling that Halloween. He looked adorable. We made such a fuss that he insisted on sleeping in his tutu and tights. It felt like Cinderella not wanting the clock to strike midnight. Susan had suggested the costume. I agreed, thinking it was a harmless, fun indulgence, though I knew deep down that her reasons weren't entirely innocent. She had longed for a daughter throughout her pregnancy, partly for a partner in all things feminine, but mostly because her husband had wanted a son. And at that point in their marriage, They were both determined to get what the other didn't want. The more Jack talked about a future all-American boy, the more Susan imagined a future Miss America. When Daniel was born, Jack was thrilled. But having an heir didn't fix their troubled marriage. Susan loved Daniel, even though he wasn't the girl she had hoped for. Jack loved other women, and being a father didn't stop him from his affairs. Susan knew about his infidelities but didn't know how to handle them. Then Jack's reckless driving ended the situation when he collided with a semi while rushing to meet a secretary at a motel, as tawdry as his life. Fortunately, Jack was skilled at making money, and his legacy to Susan was a substantial inheritance. Daniel was left a trust of equal worth. Determined that Daniel wouldn't follow in his father's footsteps, Susan promised herself that the only thing Daniel would inherit from Jack was his money. The little boy who had just flounced off to his room was proving Susan had kept that promise. "Susan, there's a lot at stake here," I said, snapping out of my thoughts. "I know," she sighed. "I might be ruining his life, but as strange as it seems, I don't think I am. I know my son. He's asking for help, my help, and I'm asking for yours." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "It doesn't take a Freud to see that this situation says as much about me as it does about Daniel," Susan continued. "This isn't your typical mother-son dynamic. I think we need counseling. But before we take that step, I need to know what Daniel really wants." I interrupted her. "Because you already know what you want. I enjoy seeing him like this more than I should," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I realize that, but I can't say it's what I truly want, especially if it's harming him. I've lost all objectivity. Please, spend the weekend with us. Daniel will let his guard down with you. By tomorrow, you'll know whether he needs help or I do. Or maybe you both do," I said, finishing her thought. "Wouldn't it be easier just to tell him he's been punished enough and let him out of those clothes? This isn't about punishment anymore, and you know it," Susan said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's about whether my son wants to be a sissy and why I don't seem to mind if he is." She sobbed then. "Okay," I relented. "Let me talk to him alone for a few minutes." As I climbed the stairs to Daniel's room, I wiped away a few tears of my own. It's no wonder cosmetics are a billion-dollar industry. As long as women cry, there will be a need for makeup touch-ups. Reflexively, I checked my makeup in the hallway mirror. Daniel's door was open. He was sitting on his bed, and when he saw me, his eyes welled up too. Without thinking, he reached for his purse and pulled out a tissue. "Let me do that," I said, sitting beside him and gently taking the tissue. As I dabbed his tears, I said, "Quite the mess you've gotten yourself into, huh?" He could only nod. "Ever heard the saying, if you're in a hole, stop digging?" He shook his head. "Think about it," I said. "What would happen if you kept digging a hole?" "It would get deeper," he replied. "And would that make it easier or harder to get out?" "Harder, I guess." "Now, let me ask you," I continued. "What's the quickest way out of that dress? Acting like a stubborn little boy digging the hole deeper, or acting like a dainty little girl who needs rescuing?" "Like a girl," he whispered, unable to repeat the word dainty. "And what if that girl had a friend like me to help pull her out of that hole? A friend who would never tell anyone about this?" "You won't tell?" "I promise. But I don't know how to act like a girl." "Well, aren't you lucky that I've had a lifetime of practice?" "But what if it doesn't work?" "Not a chance," I said, squeezing his hand between mine. "I just bought a new pair of shoes. I'm not about to fall in that hole and get them dirty." He laughed, probably the first real laugh in a long time. "Monday is still 2 whole days away," he said, his voice filled with despair. "All the more reason to get out of that hole and enjoy yourself." "Yeah, sure," he said. "I've never had so much fun." "You're digging again," I said with a smile. "I don't get it. Will the time go faster if you dread every minute, or if you relax and enjoy it?" "It's called going with the flow." "You mean I should act like I enjoy dressing up in girls' clothes? If you can't beat 'em, join 'em." "But what if someone finds out?" Look, your mom isn't going to tell. I'm not going to tell. And I don't think you're going to tell, either. So who's to know? He hesitated, looking unsure. Think of it as a game, I said. May I tell you a secret? Okay. It would be fun for me too. It would. His mood lightened. Why? Oh, I don't know. Let's just say that girls, even grown-up ones like me, never grow too old for a bit of dress-up fun. I'll try, he said, though still unsure. It won't be that hard, I said, taking his hand and leading him out of the room. Besides, you're off to a good start. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, there are real little girls who aren't nearly as pretty as you look right now. He blushed deeply, color spreading quickly across his face like a flower blooming in fast forward. At the top of the stairs, I stopped and squatted down so we were at eye level. You're going to be fine, I said, kissing him on the forehead. It'll be over before you know it. Now, let's go show your mom how lucky she is to have such a sweet little. I paused and winked at him. Daughter. He grimaced at the idea, but as he walked down the stairs, I thought I saw a slight bounce to his step.